for having me. As Ryan said, I'm Jesse Kanson-Benanav. I'm Executive Director at Abundant Housing Massachusetts. We are a statewide coalition of pro-housing advocates, working to expand the stock of, affordable and affordable market rate housing in communities around the state. We do that in two primary ways. As Ryan alluded to, we do local advocacy. We have 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, 351 different zoning boards, planning boards, land use planning, zoning, development approvals all happen on the local level here in Massachusetts. So we need a base of advocates in so many communities around the states, as Becky was saying, to show up at your city and town halls, your town meetings, your council meetings, and advocate for more homes, for affordable development, for pro-housing zoning changes. So we've invested a lot in that work. Also do state level policy advocacy and the recognizing that the power that cities have to zone for, approve or not approve new housing does come from the state. Actually, in Massachusetts, the state constitution gives land use planning powers to the legislature, but over the years, the legislature has given that power to cities and towns. Local control is very important in Massachusetts, but it has also at times gotten us into the situation where we're just not doing enough. Municipalities are making decisions, from their own perspective without thinking about how the choices that they make to grow or not to grow impact their neighboring communities, the regions, or the state at large. We're really coming to this recognizing that we have a severe housing shortage across Massachusetts. A statistic I like to talk about is in the 30 years prior to 1990, our Commonwealth built about 900,000 new homes. In the 30 years plus since 1990, we've built about half as many, about just over 450,000 new homes. And that's at a time where our state's economy as a whole has grown, our population has grown, and we've then created a scenario where we're forcing folks across income spectrums to compete with each other for this very limited supply of housing. So that means working families or lower income households, seniors on limited income certainly, as they try to figure out their housing choices, they have to compete with wealthier folks, higher income folks for this very limited supply of housing. From our perspective, the solution is working for housing abundance. We want to create the choice, more choice for people to choose where they want to live, when they want to move, and not because they have to, because they're forced out through gentrification, displacement, or just lack of affordable supply in their communities. So that's the work that we're trying to do through Abundant Housing Massachusetts and with our partners from the regional planning agencies, AARP, CHAPA, and others. We're really lucky here in Massachusetts to have a really strong industry, for lack of a better term, of housing and smart planning advocates and organizations here in the Commonwealth. But we're just trying to add the voice and bring up the voice of average folks who may not be in the housing field, may not speak the housing language, but see the challenges that they have affording to live in their communities, of finding affordable options for senior family members to age in their communities, or maybe even for young people who've left the region or the state for college, the trouble that they have finding affordable options in the communities where they were raised in. So that's what we tried to do at Abundant Housing. We did work a lot on the housing bond bill, the Affordable Homes Act, just to sort of give the sort of high-level description of why this bill, right? So we do these 5-year bonding authorizations in Massachusetts on housing. We do bonding bills on other issue areas as well, but we do housing every 5 years. And these are bonding bills or borrowing bills. This is the legislature authorizing the state to essentially borrow money to pay for the programs that Becky did such a great overview of. It's not a spending bill, it's not a budget, it's not taking money from the state budget and authorizing the spending. It's saying we can borrow it. It doesn't actually mean that it will all get borrowed and eventually spent. But the reality is that this is a historic bond bill, historic spending authorization. The last bond bill 5 years ago, when Charlie Baker was governor, was a record at that time, $1.8 billion. 5 years later, certainly, the housing crisis has accelerated. It's become one of the top issues when you ask voters around the state, or when you poll voters around the state about what their concerns are. Housing floats up to be number one. And I think because it's such a major concern, when Governor Healy proposed this bill back in October of last year, she proposed what was then $4 billion and has raised to, through the legislative process, $5 billion. So we've gone from the record $1.8 billion bond bill 5 years ago to this record $5 and some change billion today. I think Becky's description was great. I mean, there's so much in this bill, particularly on the bonding side. Another I think element of this that's worth mentioning is that often our legislature likes to separate policy items out from bonding and spending items. So they'll do the budget and they're very resistant to put non-budget policy items in the bill, or same thing with bonding bills like this one. So I believe there was no policy change included in the bond bill 5 years ago. It was purely the bonding side of things. This year, when Governor Healy proposed the bill back in October, she included around 18 policy items. These are policy changes that don't require borrowing and spending necessarily, but were intended to address the growing housing crisis that's affecting all regions of our state through innovative policy interventions. I think there's not really a whole lot on sort of the overview of what's in the bill that I would add. I think Becky's description was so great. I will talk in a minute in more detail about the accessory dwelling unit piece, which is where we as Abundant Housing put a lot of energy into. But there are sort of a couple other pieces, both sort of the bonding and policy side, that I wanted to highlight again, underscore what Becky said, or add a little bit more, or add some additional things, particularly on the policy side. So one of the major items, and Becky did mention this on the bonding side, was $2 billion for to invest in our state public housing portfolio. And this is really, really important because I don't know how many folks are aware. I'm sure many of you do know this. We're actually fairly unique here in Massachusetts. We're one of, I think, as I understand, just 3 states that decades ago developed our own portfolio of state-owned and managed public housing. Right? This is completely independent of the federal government, of HUD. We do have federal public housing around the state, but this is housing thousands and thousands of units around the state of Massachusetts that's never had any investment from the federal government. Like the federal public housing stock, unfortunately, the stock of state-funded public housing has not been adequately funded and maintained for decades through subsequent administrations, regardless of party. This has been a challenge. And so this is a real important sort of safety net housing option for many people. The primary population served by our state-owned public housing, not exclusively, but to a large degree, is seniors, older adults, and people with disabilities that are benefiting from the state-owned public housing. So investing $2 billion in rehabilitating state-owned public housing, giving local housing authorities more resources to expand the stock of state-funded public housing, and then greening through sustainability methods, that public housing, really bringing this housing into the 21st century. It's something we've not done well in Massachusetts. I would say it's sort of, it's a real failure of policy leadership for decades here in the state. And so investing $2 billion into that will be really important. So that's one thing on the bonding side. Couple policy items that I wanted to mention. At the same day that Governor Healy, back in October of 23, announced her proposed housing bond bill, she also convened two sort of working groups or commissions. One is a commission on unlocking housing production that actually I had the opportunity to be appointed to, and we're looking at what are other interventions, other policy changes around land use planning, zoning, statewide planning, et cetera, that will help unlock housing production around the region. So very fortunate to serve on that one. The second one she proposed through executive action was creating a state housing plan. And so right now there is work going on with folks from around the state. I know Keith Ferry from Wayfinders is on that. I know there's other folks from Western Mass and every other region of the state, which is really setting like what is going to be the goal we need to reach as a state in terms of the number of homes that we need to build to help address this lack of supply. And then break that down into every region, and I think every community in every region, all 351 cities and towns. So really giving us a shared understanding of what do we need to be doing as individual communities, as regions, and as the state to get to that delta in terms of supply where we need to be. So as part of the bond bill, they actually authorized or now required the creation of a state housing plan every 5 years. And so that's really important. If you think about where we were as a state 5 years ago, certainly there was housing affordability challenges, but even in the last 5 years, things have bubbled up and the crisis has gotten even worse. So it's really important that we're constantly looking at what we've done over the last 5 years, how many more homes we've added, where each region is, because certainly I understand Western Mass is different than Greater Boston. And so breaking it down and setting a goal for every region and every community. So that was another thing in the bond bill that I'm excited to see. And I know this first plan should be coming out, I believe, early next year. That's not the commission I'm on. That's another one. So I don't know all the details on that one. And then I think one other policy change that I am excited about is dealing with eviction ceiling. We've had, as folks may know, what I think is a pretty archaic eviction process in Massachusetts, where even if you had an eviction proceeding initiated against you, but it never actually got to the eviction, you were never actually pushed out, that remains on your record forever. In fact, it used to be that a minor child living in that household would also have that eviction on their record. The legislature fortunately dealt with that last session. But what we're now doing in Massachusetts is essentially saying that records around eviction proceedings that have started but never finished, or evictions for simply non-payment of rent, but not for other more problematic issues like destruction of property, et cetera, eventually after a number of years, your record is sealed. Because that has been a barrier for many people, including low-income folks, to have access to rental housing that they need. I like to think of it in terms of credit scores in the United States, right? You can run up large debt on your credit card, not pay your bills, your credit score will drop, but you do have the ability to repair your credit over a few years, and that won't eventually prohibit you from getting the credit you need to buy a car or rent a house or things like that, or get a credit card. Similar now for evictions in Massachusetts. And it's not, again, not that all evictions will not appear on your record, but some of those sort of lower level evictions or proceedings won't. So I think that's really important. I was glad to hear that Becky has a copy of the fact sheet that the administration produced. There's so much in this bill. Again, it is a bonding bill. It authorizes spending. It doesn't mean every program will actually be initiated. So I think it's worth saying, working with organizations like AARP, regional planning agencies, making sure that, and with your legislators, making sure that there's eyes kept on this, and that some of these really innovative programs that are authorized in the bill, that the bonding actually gets borrowed. The money actually gets borrowed and spent on these programs. So there's a lot of advocacy to continue to do over the next 5 years to make sure a lot of the good stuff that is authorized comes out of this. I want to talk about the accessory dwelling units. I think Ryan and Becky both gave a lot of really useful information. We need a lot of tools in our toolkit here in Massachusetts to address the fact that the way many communities across the state have used zoning is exclusionary, right? When the only thing that you can build in a community is a very large lot, single family home with the size of the single family homes increasing, you're limiting, when you limit the housing stock that can be built in the community, you're limiting the choices in the community, and you're limiting who has access to that community. And that's why we see so much economic and racial segregation throughout Massachusetts. And so one thing that we focus on a lot at Abundant Housing is how do we break down zoning as a barrier and use it as an opportunity to create more housing choice. And we need a lot of tools in that toolkit to do that. So I imagine folks, although it doesn't impact Western Mass, have heard at least about the MBTA Communities Act out in Eastern Mass. It's been in the news this week because Attorney General Campbell has sued the town of Milton for noncompliance with that act. But that was one strategy that the legislature implemented to deal with local zoning in the MBTA region and make sure that every community that's served by the T has at least one zoning district where multifamily housing or missing middle housing, as Becky mentioned, is allowed by right. So that's one really important strategy that in Eastern Massachusetts can potentially open up opportunities to build over 200,000 homes. That's about where we are in terms of the housing shortage right now in Massachusetts, about 200,000 homes. So that's one really important tool out in the eastern portion of the state, but we recognize we also need to create tools that give the opportunity to create more housing choice in every community of the state. And so the accessory dwelling units legalization is really important. That has direct impact on Western Mass and every other corner of the state. So Ryan talked a little bit about why ADUs are so important, right? ADUs are a gentle way to add more housing stock to a community. It doesn't require large multifamily development. It can have lower impact on wastewater issues, which I know can be a challenge out here in other regions like on the Cape. It gives homeowners an opportunity to help generate some income and or as Ryan mentioned, to help give a housing opportunity to a caregiver, an elder family member, or family member with a disability, or even a young person returning from college. We actually have a member of ours who's a town councilor out in the town of Franklin, in sort of Metro West Boston, who lives in an ADU in his parents' backyard that they previously built for his now passed grandfather. So it's become this multi-generational tool to give housing opportunities to that family. As Ryan mentioned, we have had a real patchwork of ADU bylaws in Massachusetts for some time. 351 cities and towns, hundreds of different ADU bylaws. Some communities simply didn't allow ADUs to be built. Some communities had restrictions on who could live in the ADU or who you could rent it to, variations in the size of accessory dwelling unit that was allowed. Some communities said you can't do a detached backyard ADU. You can only do it in the existing footprint or as an addition to your primary dwelling. So that meant that the industry of builders, developers, lenders, financiers, etc., who will help homeowners build ADUs didn't sprout up in Massachusetts like we've seen in other states that have had a minimum statewide standard for the ADUs that must be allowed in all communities. In fact, going all the way out west to California, they had a similar situation prior to 2017, where there was a real patchwork of ADU laws that were allowed there. In 2017, they revised and standardized and created this minimum standard that every community in California would have to implement in terms of allowing ADUs. And production of accessory dwelling units went from just 2% of new housing stock in California prior to 17 to up to 18% of new housing production in California as of 2022. That's the last year of an actual statistic I have, but anecdotally I've heard it's actually increased. So out in California, ADUs have, with this statewide minimum standard, become a much larger proportion of the housing production, meeting the needs of a variety of families and households around that state. So we were really lucky to be working with the Healy administration, with partners like AARP and others, to really push on this piece of the bond bill. If you own a single family home or own a home in a single family zoning district in Massachusetts right now, which is the vast majority of residential zoned land in the state, as of February 2nd, you will have the right to build an accessory dwelling unit of up to 900 square feet, or half the size of your single family home, whichever is smaller. So really, under this law, 900 square foot ADUs are going to be the max ADU size that's allowed to be built. And what's really important is that this will be allowed by right. So communities cannot require you to get a special permit or have to get certain variances to build an ADU. And it authorizes the three types of ADUs that I mentioned a minute ago. You can build a backyard cottage, a detached ADU, or maybe convert a carriage house or a garage to living quarters. You can build an extension on to your existing single family, or you could even subdivide your single family into 2 units. That will have to be allowed as of right. 2 other really important pieces of this bill that I think actually makes our new law here stand apart from the other New England states and many other states around the country. There is limitations on the number of parking units that a municipality can require a homeowner to build with an ADU, and that is, to be clear, off-street parking. So if you live within half mile of a transit station in Massachusetts, so that's going to be rail. This is going to mostly have impact sort of in the eastern portion of the state, but could have some around Amtrak stations out here. Rail, light rail, subway, bus stations, large bus stations, and ferry terminals. The municipality cannot require you to build any off-street parking for your ADU. Outside of half a mile of a transit station, the municipality cannot require you to build more than 1 off-street parking. This is not an attack on parking. Obviously, cars are important, particularly as you get outside of, let's be honest, the Boston urban core, where most of the rail transit is in the state. Obviously you need cars to get around, but requiring excessive off-street parking has been a barrier to building all types of new homes that we need in Massachusetts. And it's not to say that a homeowner building an ADU couldn't build an additional off-street parking. It's just saying the municipality cannot require them to do that. And so that will help rein in the cost of building these ADUs. The third really important piece, and this gets sort of complicated and counterintuitive at times, is that municipalities cannot require owner occupancy to build an ADU. So many communities in Massachusetts that have ADU bylaws right now say you can only build an ADU on your property if you live in the single family home. And there's actually research from AARP nationally that says the vast majority of ADUs are built by owner occupants. But the real problem with these owner occupancy restrictions is that it actually makes it difficult for homeowners, even that intend to live on the property, really difficult for them to get financing. Because who do you get financing from? You get financing from banks. Banks are relatively risk averse. Banks don't want to lend you a mortgage if there is an outside encumbrance on it that says, if God forbid they need to take your property in foreclosure, that they're stuck with an ADU that is in violation of the local law, because a bank is never going to be an owner occupant. The banks have assured me, we're not in the business of holding on to properties. We want to get rid of foreclosed properties to sell them as quick as possible. But that becomes more difficult for us to do when we limit the pool of buyers who we can get these properties to. So that's why banks aren't likely to lend in jurisdictions where are these owner occupancy restrictions. Additionally, it's a challenge for non-bank, for owners, for average people, right? If a family member has a property with an ADU, they live on the property, if they pass away and you are given their property as inheritance, but you don't live there, or you can't move there, but you want to hold on to the property for whatever reason, it then becomes in violation of owner occupancy. So there's direct impacts on just everyday owners as well, in addition to that restriction from the banks. And so that was really, really important. It was counterintuitive to a lot of folks in the legislature. We certainly want to see homeowners be the primary beneficiary of the legalization of these new ADUs, and the people that they rent to, whether family members, caregivers, or just renters in their community. But including that they have to be allowed by right, limitations on off-street parking, and the restriction on owner occupancy was really important. We're now at a point where I would say, based on my knowledge of ADU laws around New England, and before August, when the bond bill passed the legislature, we were the only New England state that didn't have some version of a statewide ADU law. We are now the state with the strongest ADU law in New England that I think is most likely to produce ADUs across the state. There have been some real challenges with the way they've crafted it in Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine with owner occupancy restrictions, or the option of towns to opt out. So that's not going to happen here. I've also been told, based on some national networks that I'm a part of, that we now have one of the strongest ADU laws east of the Rockies. I'm really happy that we got this ADU piece done. I think the bill itself, with all the bonding that's supposed to happen, can have real impact in helping us produce the homes that we need around the state. I think there is a lot more that's going to need to be done in the next session that begins in January. Look forward to working with AARP, with other advocates, to make sure that we keep housing on the agenda in the legislature. Often our legislature likes to do something on an issue and then not touch it for another 4, 5, or 6 years. We can't let that happen. We have a housing crisis around the state right now that's only growing, and we need to do more. So I'll close there, and thank you.